This is Ryan Risley here, and I'm doing a video presentation for CRJ 306, Race, Ethnicity, and Crime. And today I'm going to talk about the Marshall Hypothesis. And this hypothesis was developed by Thurgood Marshall. He was a U.S. Supreme Court Justice from 1967 to 1991. And what he asserted in this hypothesis was that support for the death penalty was due in large part to a lack of knowledge of it. And if the general public were to be given all of the information about the death penalty, they would find it to be both unconstitutional and immoral. Some of the statistics he used for this, or information rather, is that the death sentence is not as much as a deterrent as life in prison is. And that means to keep people from wanting to commit crimes. So, life in prison, he argued, was a much better way to get people to stop, or at least think really hard about committing a crime and what those consequences would be. Also, the cost of executing somebody is actually more expensive than it is to keep somebody in prison for life. And he thought that these facts would influence people, but he thought it would be extremely hard to convince people that the death penalty is immoral. This is because society's attitude in general is that of retribution for crimes. And if somebody does something wrong, we support punishment for it, which is fitting with the death penalty. Marshall instead wants us to focus on the rehabilitation side of it, which is teaching and allowing a criminal to become rehabilitated and later a functioning member of society, effectively giving him a second chance. Another part of that is the discrimination in the death penalty. And in Furman versus Georgia in 1972, one of the statistics that he used was 455 people were executed for rape, and 405 of them were African Americans, and only 48 of them were white. And he said this shows evidence of racial discrimination because African Americans were executed far more often than white people in proportion to their percentage of the population. Another big one is execution of innocent people. He stated there was evidence of people being executed before their innocence can be proven. And that right there is a huge deal, because if that were to happen, then the criminal justice system kind of failed on that regard. And, even having any percentage of a chance for that to happen is something that Marshall didn't want to happen. Another interesting point that he brought up is that prosecutors, they live to get convictions. So sometimes they may take immoral measures to ensure that they get these convictions. And it's certainly something to think about if immoral measures were taken to get convictions, in turn to then have the criminal or person put on death row and eventually a death penalty. So there's a lot of questions there of corruption and things like that he brought about in the Furman versus Georgia case that I found to be very interesting. But in summary, the main point I think he was trying to drive home is that the lack of knowledge, or one could say ignorance, it influences attitudes. And the citizens of the United States lack the knowledge of the death penalty and its effects. And Marshall really was pushing for information to be brought out about the death penalty and if it was, then the general public would not support the death penalty after being presented all of these things. And that's all I have for you today. This was supposed to be a 2-minute presentation. It was about 5 minutes. I hope you were able to learn a little bit about it, and know who Thurgood Marshall was, and I hope I can nay. Okay, bye.